Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director here. It's great to have you with us. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Dana Connors. And to do so, I want to ask you to take a moment to picture yourself, and this is probably going to be hard for some of you, picture yourself in your early 20s. Just try, I know it's hard. You've come, and maybe there's some people here that are going to have to use, on the Zoom audience, who are going to have to use more of their imagination for that, but try. You've completed your undergraduate degree at a wonderful university whose mascot is the black bear. Sound familiar? At the age of 23, you're offered a job as city manager of the largest city in the second largest county east of the Mississippi River. Do you take the job even though you're completely wet behind the ears? Of course you do. And after 16 years in that role, how about serving as the commissioner of the Maine Department of Transportation? Ready for something different? Why not lead the Maine State Chamber of Commerce for another 30 years, more or less? Believe it or not, this is Dana Connors' story, a life of public service focused on building a better world right here in Maine. I know that many Maine students want to pursue careers where they can make a difference and contribute to something larger than their individual lives, just like Dana. Remember that the university from which he received his bachelor's in public administration, or Black Bears, 50 years later, that same university awarded him an honorary doctorate. So maybe there's something to look forward to in the future for all of us. You don't have to be a student to learn valuable lessons from Dana. For example, he's also a member of the Mitchell Center Advisory Board, where he's been a wonderful mentor and friend to me and everyone connected with the Mitchell Center. Please join me in welcoming Dana Connors.
Thank you, Dave. And my hats off to you, to Ruth, to Carol, for the incredible work that you do here at the Mitchell Center. And I hope the university in today's world, as well as the future, recognizes how valuable you are and have been and will be in the future. It is public service, perhaps coming from me, and it may sound a bit prejudiced, but truth is, it's a very rewarding career. So I hope at least you consider it. And as you came in, there are words of wisdom on board that comes from a senator, a wise person who I know personally, who has done amazing work for the country. His name is George Mitchell. And he reminds us by those words that are printed on the board as you go out, on the wall as you go out or come in. Take a moment, look at them, because they are a few lines that express 1,000 things and value statements about public service. But I'm here today, and I know that I have about 50 minutes because at 4 o'clock, the Cinderella ball, and half of you have to leave, if not more. And I want to be respectful of that. But I also have a bad habit, and that is rambling. As they say, you get down that rabbit hole, and sometimes it's hard to get out. So Dave is going to try to control me in that respect.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck. You're right. You've heard me talk before. Actually, I'm here today to actually to comply with the request, to take a look at those 3 positions that I've held, which total 57 years, and to speak to some of the lessons that I've learned over the course of those experiences. And I think David referenced it, but the truth of the matter is I was 23. I turned 24 the next month. But I was in Prescott, which was the love of my life. For 16 years. I had a city council that were 5 distinguished leaders in the city. And my next job was with Joe Brennan, who was the governor at that time, a Democratic governor. I was there for 11 years, 3 with him as he finished his 8-year term. But the Republican governor that followed him, Jock McKernan, kept me on in that position for a total of between the two of 11 years. And then 84 came along and I decided that I would look at something different and took the position of president CEO of Chamber of Commerce. As Dave mentioned, I was there for 30 years. And what were the lessons that I may have picked up on or failed at or whatever the case may be? Nevertheless, there were still lessons to be learned. And I will do that. I'll be very candid and share that with you, but I also want to do it in a different or a perhaps modified way, which is to look at the 7 governors, 6 of whom I either worked for or worked with while I was in particularly the last 2 positions. There is one that I didn't work for or didn't work with. I'm going to include him because he was so instrumental in really providing for you essence of a lesson that I learned by way of what he accomplished in his 8 years. So I'm going to try to do that. Why do I do the governors? Well, because of the relationship, they set the stage and built a foundation for so many things that I needed to know, maybe I should have known and didn't know. But they were all lessons, meaningful lessons. I did it because each of them had significant challenges to face while they were governor. Every single one of them had success in their mission, in their effort. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the challenges or all the success stories, but nevertheless, they had challenges.
Because they did, I can't, as I said, I can't speak to all of the challenges nor all the successes, but I will try to pick out some just to illustrate and to try to put forward the lessons that were learned. And thirdly, I must tell you that I respected each and every one of them, great admiration for what they were able to do. I would also say that I ended up being big fans and in the process realized how complex it is to be in charge in the responsibilities as a governor of the state of Maine in so many ways. So let me begin with, I want to start with the city manager, but before I do that, I want to set the stage for actually 4 of those lessons learned in the broadest sense. And although they may be a bit vague, but they'll become clear, but some of them are very clear, even to say. They are the broad lessons learned that you will see woven in the stories of the governor or myself. The first one is, I plagiarize on this because I read it some time ago. In public policy, muscle doesn't do what working with others will. Muscle doesn't do what working with others can and will. Kind of a modification of that might be, we give a lot of credit for what gets accomplished. What are the results? What are the success stories? But what's not often given equal, but it is extremely valuable, is the way you do it. The way you do it is really very instrumental in the success that's enjoyed. Or, as you'll read in your textbook, politics is the art of compromise. Think about that in today's context. Politics is the art of compromise. That tells you a lot about what should be, but also what isn't necessarily today. There are 4 that I want to just set the stage broad. Another one is, because public policy legislation can be very complex, quite controversial, it's rare that something that has that much meaning is going to be one and done. So in policy, you have to be kind of persistent. If you believe strongly in something, you need to be persistent in this pursuit of what you're trying to accomplish, but patient, because time is a value statement. And if you want the results you want, it's going to require you to be persistent, but also patient. The other one is like in private as well as public. There is little room for arrogance or ego, but all kinds of room and value and confidence that comes by way of knowledge of what you're doing and the experience that goes with it. Not to mention humility. Confidence earned by knowledge, by experience, add to that humility, and you've got a winner. The fourth is one that I have learned over the years, that there are two things that unite all of us in the state, regardless of what you do, where you live, or what your politics is. Those two things are the economy and people. We want our economy to be strong, robust, and to serve. We want our people to be educated with the skill, with the knowledge to allow them to grow and to prosper. The question is, how do we do that? Well, I can tell you education is fundamental to how we do that. But at the same time, it also requires things like you can't satisfy everybody all the time. So you do need a sense of priorities. What are the priorities? What are the issues? What are the programs, initiatives that best serve the economy and the people? So you need a plan. You need to establish the priorities. And my pet peeve is, while we talk about the positive, a negative, you cannot forget the positive. There isn't a business that's successful in the world that doesn't market themselves. Maine needs to do a better job of speaking to the great things, why we live here, what it offers us, what the opportunities may be, and what are the things that are appealing. Why do people want to come here? And we've seen it in the past several years since the COVID. People do want to come to Maine, and the evidence is there. So those are four things that just kind of keep in mind. There will be others that I'll bring to bear, but they're probably more personal or just as a result of what I'm perhaps sharing with you. So let me begin at the beginning. I was 23 years old, just as Dave said, and my first lesson learned was the value of internships. I have learned since that time, and I've had a number of them when I was undergraduate or graduate here. And by the way, it's wonderful to be back at the alma mater. But undergraduate or graduate and went on to be a city manager and commissioner, I had a number of interns that would come to Prescott, where I was city manager, or to Augusta as commissioner of transportation, simply because I knew what it did for me. I became city manager at 23, not because I provided them a great experience and certainly not skill, but because of the intern, which is the value of internships. They get to know you. They know your personality. They know your work ethic. They know the things that are important to them. So when the city manager resigned to go to Concord, New Hampshire, they offered me the job. Now, I'm sure I went into that with more confidence than I should have, and thinking that I was more informed than I really was, because I didn't know what I didn't know. And, but I will say this, the other lesson that I clearly learned very quickly is how valuable it is to have that's why I talked about the city council being my boss. The governor was my boss at DOT, although 186 legislators from time to time would think they're your boss. And when I had a board at the chamber, I had 90 people as a board. And the importance of that is they are the body that can build that confidence. They are the ones, they do that by supporting you when you may make a mistake, because there is a risk and reward. And if you're afraid to take a risk because you're going to be punished or reprimanded or something, you're less likely to do it. And truthfully, I made mistakes. There's no question about that, because I thought I knew more than I did. But the board was so fundamentally supportive, and they would go out of their way to make me feel comfortable or that I was doing a good job, that I can't tell you how much that meant. Because Prescott was a very progressive city. We had We've applied for funds for an indoor swimming pool, for a multi-purpose building. We had one of the first bike paths, walkways in the city, went straight through the city because we acquired it from a railroad that decided to abandon it and give it to us for $1. So the city was very progressive. I had a lot of room to make mistakes, but even when you did, it was a learning experience. And I can't say enough about the value that a board brings to a person who thinks they know more than they do, but comes to grips with the fact that, yeah, I guess you really don't, but they're there to help you by learning. That was an amazing, and I stayed there until late 1983. And even then, I had a hard time to leave because I loved the work. I loved the city. They're incredibly supportive. But we lost our major business. It was a processing plant called Potato Service, and they had made an arrangement with another processing plant to acquire them. They were going to shut it down. So we were going to lose a lot of employment, plus we were going to lose a number one taxpayer. So 4 of us came together. We went across the country. We found a company that's willing to come, and we put a package together that was called Simplot to acquire it. We ended up, because the other company was declaring bankruptcy that was already there, we went to in Brooklyn, and went through bankruptcy. And I remember, here's where the council really stood behind me. The attorney we had for the city asked me to take the stand while the judge wanted to ask me questions about the business and where we stood and why we were going after this company. And the answer to that was pretty self-evident. But then he said, are you prepared financially to be able to do this? There is no value like naivety in a case like this. I said, yes, Your Honor, we have the financial wherewithal. I didn't realize for sure whether we did or didn't, but I knew if I said no, they weren't going to give it to us. So I got back and explained to the council, and they were 100% on board. So that was a learning lesson that worked for me, but it could have gone the other way just as easily. But as history tells, it was fine, and the board is to be credited for that. So before I go to picking up the action with Joe Brennan, who was the governor in his last 3 years of an 8-year term as governor, I want to go to the governor that I did not know, but years later, I've got to tell you, I had the greatest admiration for that's humanly possible. That person is Ken Curtis. He was there from 1967 until 75, 8 years. He came in 1967 to be governor as I became city manager, and that's where we're the only thing that's similar about the two of us. He was governor at 35 years of age, governor of the state of Maine. And he walked into that position probably, he may have known about it, but he walked into a state government that was in a array, totally out of touch with where it needed to be in order to really fulfill the needs of the state. I'll give you an example. There were over 200 agencies and or departments. And the departments, the governor's position had just gone from a 2-year term to a 4-year term a few years prior to Ken. And none of the commissioners were concurrent. In other words, their term wasn't the same as the governor's. Most of them had 7 years terms, and they weren't consistent. They weren't concurrent with what the governor is. It was overlap. So they were kind of their own boss in their minds. And on top of that, there was an executive council. The executive council was 7, they were all men at that time, 7 men that were appointed by the majority party, which at the time was the Republican in the Senate, Republican in the House, and Ken was a Democrat. And the executive council had more power than the governor. They had to approve every appointment. They were the ones that accept any type of discipline or removal action. And in Ken's first term, first 4 years, because the revenues were slacking and the alternatives means of generating revenue was pretty bleak, he got past the income tax. And needless to say, in his run for the second term, the Republican took him to task for that. Here's Paul Harvey's the rest of the story. He was able to modernize state government so that commissioners were concurrent with the governor, that the executive council was abolished, that he won re-election by a landslide, that the modernization of state government lies firmly at his foundation of effort. And he brought in some very bright, able, younger people to be keys to his administration. The question is, how did he do that? He had Republican in both bodies. He was a Democrat. Well, remember, it's what I said, muscle doesn't always do it, but working with others will. He had a personality that you could not deny. He was a wonderful person. He was friendly. You could not dislike Ken Curtis. And he was so successful that came to pass, the things that I mentioned. He went on to become the ambassador to Canada under Carter, President Carter, and he also was in charge of the National Democratic Conference. Super guy. I learned so much about not just what you do, but the way you do it, that politics really is the art of compromise. And he had that down to a science or an art, however you choose. Okay. Joe Brennan. Joe came in, well, before Joe, there was a 5-year period of Jim Longley. Jim Longley was a very successful insurance executive in the Auburn-Lewiston area. And he also headed up a Blue Ribbon Commission that Governor Curtis established called Cost Management and Survey, a Blue Ribbon Commission that included several people, but he was the main person that chaired it, plus went on speaking terms about it, listening term, and so forth. And the condition was when he was, so I'm told, when he was appointed the chair, it was very clear that he was not to use that to run for governor, excuse me. But he did. And he brought a whole new style in his 4 years. He did not run again, but he brought a new style in. Those who worked for him, they would meet all times of night or day or over the weekend. And he was a religious man who some of his language wasn't so religious, but nevertheless, he was steadfast, he was dedicated, he was hardworking, and but decided not to run. I'm not sure what would have happened had he run. But I want to share with you something that is a little offbeat, but it comes back, I think, in a positive way. When Jim Longley ran for governor, against him were two people whose name, well, one of them becomes very prominent in our story. The person who was running at the same time as Jim was George Mitchell as Democrat. Now, George, to be the candidate, had to beat Joe Brennan. Joe ran against George Mitchell in the primary. And on the other person representing the Republicans was Jim Irwin, who was in the legislature, attorney for Pierce Atwood, and was attorney general. So it was really anticipated that the battle was between Irwin and Mitchell. The truth is, Longley won. Now keep the other dynamic kind of in the back of your mind, because we come back and visit it in a different way. So under Joe Brennan, he was a moderate Democrat who I came in the last 3 years of his administration, and it was clear that I was at DOT, but I was like a fish out of water. I was really uncomfortable in the position because I'm not an engineer. I wasn't trained as an engineer. And yet I was surrounded by engineers. And so it was really quite uncomfortable. And I felt so at home. I kept wondering, why did I leave my job? Fast forward, It was one of the best jobs I ever had. Why? Because of what you were doing. You had a fundamental purpose in dealing with the foundation of our economy, the roads, the bridges, the rails, the public transportation, the waterways, and so forth. So the work itself was fundamentally and very important. But the other thing was Joe Brennan. He must have anticipated my discomfort in the beginning because he was out of his way supportive. Verbally to the public, he was giving me a recognition for things that I truly wondered why, because I didn't think I deserved it. But in Prescal, as well as with Joe Brennan, there are occasions where people will see in you things that you don't see in yourself. They'll see quality and value in you and what you do and how you do it, but you may not see it yourself. It may be a little insecurity you have, maybe lack of confidence, whatever, but I think he sensed it. He went out of his way to help me. The big project at that time was Sears Island. It was a project, the state had 3 ports that they designated as cargo ports. They didn't want to blemish the coast of Maine, but they did recognize the value that cargo facilities bring, because we're in a global economy and you need to get ships in to unload their product or take our products out. So one of those locations was in Sears Island, and there's an Sears Port, and there's an island called Sears Island. And we attempted to build a cargo facility there. There was one at Mac Point, but it was crowded and we didn't think it would be the best location. And so we put half of the island in public use and the other half a defined area as cargo. It wasn't very popular. And when I say be persistent, but be patient, we were extremely persistent because every federal agencies, National Marine Fisheries, EPA, Fish and Wildlife, all sued us. And so it was forever trying to get permission to move forward. We actually, during his administration, didn't. So in 1987, Jock McKernan was elected governor. Jock McKernan was not married to Olympia Snow at the time, but he was governor, and in his first term, he was, I won't say Joe Brennan was introverted. I don't know of a governor that would be introverted, but I mean, Jock took it to a new level in terms of his external transparency, his work, his involvement. Transparency is not the right word, but we would have capitals per day. And once a month, we'd go to a different city and we would talk with the city officials and others about the issues, the challenges that they had. And of course, I would have to go on all of them because everybody had a road that they wanted repaired or fixed. So I didn't miss one, much to my regret. But it was worth everything. Why? Because it touched base with the local community. It listened to them. You were learning from them, and it puts you in touch with their needs and what you could do to try to help them out. However, that was his first term. Just as he was running for re-election, Joe Brennan, who was governor, had gone to Congress for a couple of terms, wanted to come back as governor because he was good at it and he wanted to be back at it. And at the time, he noticed that the state's financial system was under duress and something needed to be done about it. So he brought it publicly, as you do when you run for office. He brought it to the attention of Jock McKernan, who was running for re-election, and said, there's some real problems. I won't say that Governor McKernan denied it, but he didn't put it in the context that it was as serious as Joe was making it. Well, Joe got reelected, and that was in November. In January, Jock had one son, and he was a great baseball fan and player for the college that he was going to, which I believe was New Hampshire. Might have been Dartmouth, but I'm not sure. he had an aneurysm and passed away while he was in the field house practicing. And of course, they were very close, father and son. And the governor was devastated, as any of us would be, when we lose a child. But the way he handled that, because at the time he was a Republican, you had Democrat Speaker of the House, and you had a Democrat President of the Senate. And the issues were obvious, concerning, and they were nailing in on that and didn't let up steam. I won't say they didn't respect the loss, but they didn't give up on the problems at hand. No mercy, as they say. And he got through it. We got through it. I mean, most of those issues, if you sit down with people and you work with people, good can come from it. And that's a lesson that for all of us at any time, in any place. But in the meantime, we had our first turnpike widening. There's 30 miles section from New Hampshire, basically where the toll booth was, to the Portland area that we tried to get past. And there was part one of that referendum, and the other part of the referendum was called sensible transportation policy, which meant that the people who put this before the public said that every highway needs to be looked at and analyzed in terms of what other modes of transportation would do that would not necessitate having to widen it. And so we lost. Now, part of that might have been I wasn't as good a debater as I should have been, could have been. The other part of that, which kind of goes with it, is that in campaigns, particularly in referendum, winner takes all. I mean, there is no negotiating. You don't negotiate. There's nothing. It's what the public has gathered. They put before the legislature. The legislature can accept it as is without any changes, or they have to send it to the public. They send it to the public, and you put up ads to represent one side or the other, and it's winner take all. I repeat myself. We lost. I did that night, though, do myself a favor, even though at the time I didn't think or necessarily consider it as such. When the cameras interviewed me at the time of loss, I said, well, we accept the outcome, and we will work with the other party to try to make sensible transportation policy a reality in terms of what they want. That was not orchestrated on my part, but it happened to be a lucky thing because it cut the tension between the two sides, and we actually did come together to work through it and work it out. The other issue that started then was also a referendum, but is one that we went to the Transportation Committee. Go back to the same point, and I gotta be sensitive to the time here because I'm starting down this rabbit hole, is that in a referendum, you accept what the referendum is, or you send it to the public. This case, it was to study and recommend the return of passenger rail to Maine from Portland to Boston. And never before had anybody ever accepted the wording, but we did at the transportation. We went before the Transportation Committee, said we accept it. And they looked at us kind of quizzical and asked what was wrong. Why would I accept it? Shouldn't it go to the public? Because all it was asking us to do was to study it and make a recommendation. It wasn't asking us to implement it. It didn't force us to do it. It just said, does this make sense? My words, not theirs. And so that's what we did. And I'm going to remind me, Dave, to talk about George Mitchell in the sense of passenger rail, but I'll skip over right now. So there was a lot of things going on at that time in the McKernan, particularly in some of the first term, but the second term. And then that would have been Joe Brennan, Jock McKernan, then Angus King came in. Now, that's the other story about candidates. When Angus King became, it's a story similar to the Jim Longley one, where the independent prevails. But at the time, Joe Brennan had come back wanting to be governor again. I told you he went after Jock, but didn't get it. So he came back and Democrat wanted to be governor again. And he could, because the term is, you can have 2 terms, 8 years. But if you stay away for a year or so, you can come back. And that's what he was doing. And the other person that was the Republican was Susan Collins. And long story short, Angus won. Now, let me tell you, before they won, Joe Brennan had appointed me in the first term. And so he came to me and said, hey, Dana, if I win the governorship, would you work for me? No, he didn't say what work for me meant, but help get started, maybe. I don't know what it meant, but I said, sure. Out of loyalty, I said, sure. Susan, I've known. She came from Caribou. I grew up in Easton, city manager in Prescal. When you're from the county, you're kind of bound at the hip. It's a wonderful thing. So loyalty said, Susan, yeah, if you want me to help you, I'd be happy to do it. Well, Angus ultimately said that, but here's what led up to it. Angus had a show at the time called Maine Watch. It was on public TV. He's very articulate. He really does his homework. And he'd have me on to beat me up over the merits of returning passenger rail or the turnpike widening. Now, I should say, under Angus, we did go back and I chaired an effort to get the turnpike widened, and we did. But that's not part of the story. That was after he had me on these shows. So he criticized me for both of those. I'd always leave the show saying, why in God's name did you subject yourself to that? Why did you just not go? But I did. And I felt it was my responsibility. But he's smarter than I, more articulate, and he prevailed more often than not. So back to the story. So it's the last week before the election. I'm in the back of the room. It's a women's event for the governor candidates. So he walks by me. He says, hey, Dana. He said, if I win, would you help me? I said, Governor, is this a joke? You put me down on all of your shows. Now you want me to work for you? And he said, work with you to get started. And he said, yeah, I do. I'm serious. I didn't oppose you. Yeah, okay. So I said, sure. Next morning he called. He said, can you be in Portland at 10 o'clock? And I said, sure. Why? He said, I want you to be my transition director. It's kind of like a chief of staff, but not a permanent ongoing position. It's just you work with the governor to actually get the commissioners appointed, to get the budget that's being presented to you under control and so forth. And we did. And it was a friendship that I respect for, and I will for the rest of my life, because very personable guy that did a lot of great things. His skill was his communication, his being able to take a tough issue and reduce it. And his big issue, he did a number of things I won't go into, but I want to go into one, because one day he calls me and said, Dana, I really want to put laptops into every 7th and 8th grader in the state. He said, what do you think about that? I said, well, let me ask you a couple of questions. Why 7th or 8th, he told me. I said, why are you doing this? And he made the case for the digital economy that we were about to erupt and become a part of our life, and how the role of technology and so forth. I said, sure. He said, well, if I have the press call you, would you speak to? I said, better yet, are you going to do a press conference? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'll go with you. So we went to Jerry Talbot in Portland, middle school, and then we went to the one in Gardner. We had a press event, and he obviously was his press event, and I just there to support him. The next morning, I had a board meeting, and I got detained a few minutes on the phone. So when I went down into the room, the meeting was taking place, the minute I walked through the door, it was dead silence. Well, that doesn't encourage me a lot. The chair at the time, who happened to be a friend, both of Angus and myself, said, Dana, what in the devil were you thinking about, you and Angus, doing that? I said, why? He said, it was the stupidest idea you guys ever had, and you supporting him was, I don't get it. And I said, oh, okay. Fast forward. It did have resistance in the legislature, big resistance, but he prevailed. He got expanded from the 7th and 8th to high school, and it was the first incidence in the country where laptops were provided to students, and the difference it made is pretty darn special. That was Angus King. Following him was John Baldacci, a wonderful retail. John I worked with because he was a great governor, a great person, a Democrat, and he tried to get the school districts, the structure consolidated, so be less of, no longer there'd be 290 structure buildings, units, I should say, or 152 superintendents, that the climate, the enrollment in schools are going from 290 to 185 or whatever it was at the time. But it's a hard one, and we didn't prevail. The effort was there, persistence is there. Today, it continues to decline, and things are happening to bring it together. The other one was called Deergo Health. It preceded the Federal American Care Act, but it was to provide subsidies for insurance to make it more affordable for healthcare. He set that up, he put it through, we supported it. There were some who were unhappy with our support for that, but it was the right thing at the right time, and it worked. After that, there was Paul LePage. Paul LePage is a perfect example that sometimes style can obscure success. So when many people were thinking of Paul, it was some of the comments he made or some of the actions that he took that he was the one who said, I'm Trump before Trump. And he would say things that were off color. But what he did was pretty remarkable. I mean, when it comes to the financial integrity of the state, he did a lot. The budget gaps were closed. He created a surplus of 176. The rainy day fund had 200 million. He paid back the hospital $750 million by virtue of the hospitals. The law was passed that expanded Medicaid for more eligibility, but never provided the funds. He did all of that. He also was involved. There was a lot of referendums that we at the chamber were involved in, and I in particular. This one, Holzer said, you cannot possibly win. You cannot win it. I'll stake my future on it. It was anybody or any business that had revenues over 200,000, there would be a 2% tax applied to them. And the money would go towards funding education. State law in Maine is you fund local education, K to 12, 55%. And we started off with 55%, but it creeped down to 52, 51. And the problem was we ended up less than a percentage. We lost less than a percentage. So the pollster who couldn't believe we come that close, because the difficulty is we had to stand up and say, we support education too. It's a foundation of success for a person or for economy. But this isn't the right way. This isn't the right method. We can't do it by adding another tax on people or business. And believe it or not, it's a combined tax. So if a husband and wife are both working, that 200,000 was within reach, and a business certainly would have revenues of itself. So it was very, well, Paul was governor, Mike Thibodeau was the Senate president. They never saw the same thing alike on any issue. But on this one, they came together and they voided the referendum, which is uncharacteristic. But the realization is whatever the public votes and approves, it's a statute. It can be modified once it's passed by legislature. It's tough to do it because the people have spoken and you don't want to appear before the people. So Paul did some great things financially, but if you ask people about Paul, you're probably going to get this style question. Another lesson in terms of how that can have a lasting perception, and perception sometimes is reality. The last was Governor Mills. Jenna. She put together, the state of Maine had for years attempted to put together a strategic plan. I think I mentioned this at the outset, but the tendency is people want to please everybody, and I understand that, that's a good thing. But if you don't have the money to do that, it's pretty hard. So what they would do, they would take the pot of money and and it wasn't a lot, they'd spread it across everybody. So everybody get a little bit, but not enough. And the thing that needed the attention the most was kind of underserved. And so the strategic plan was put together by 1,300 people. And one of the things, and the key was the two top priorities was the workforce, both the talent and the skill. The talent was that we need 65,000 more, we need 75,000 more people in the 10-year period, which is what this was designed for. But we're going to lose 65,000. So the net gain isn't what you really want or need. And so that was part of it. It was the skill and the size. The other part was innovation. It was recognizing that 50% of growth in your GDP comes from new ways, new products, new ways to do things, new things to do. And that struggled in Maine until just a few years ago when bond issue was passed for $50 million. And since then, there's been more recognition. University of Maine stands out in terms of their designation as an R1, recognized R&D facility by Carnegie. That is incredibly special. So the strategic plan, she did the climate action plan. And whenever with COVID, I took some heat for COVID because I kind of supported her, particularly in this message. In order to have a healthy economy, you've got to have healthy people. And there was a lot, we've never been through a COVID like this in our lifetime. And so what people wanted was to be able to stay open to the best of their ability, but to find a way to get rid of COVID. That was hard to do. And she brought people together, chambers were involved, it worked itself through, but it was a odd and heated period of time. I want to go back to George Mitchell because he was the one, did I say this? He was the one that in 1980, when Muskie resigned to go as Secretary of State under Carter, that his seat came open. Now remember Joe Brennan in primary when back in 75, when Longley became governor, Brennan ran against Mitchell in the primary, but Mitchell was won out. So 1980, Muskie goes on to be Secretary of State. Muskie, like Margaret Chase Smith, like Olympia, like we've been so fortunate in the state to have the leadership that we have had. Brennan, by governor, had the authority to appoint whoever he wanted to into the position Muskie held. Guess what he did? We all know what he did. He put George Mitchell into that position, even though George had beat him, and it was kind of a contested primary, and primaries or running for office can be contested and can be divisive, particularly today. But he did it, and George's legacy is amazing. I'll give you one story because we're running out of time. Passenger rail was very important to him coming back to Portland, and so he called me one day, I was at DOT, and said, hey, how's the project coming? And I said, well, it's coming well, but we have a problem. And he said, what is it? Can I help you with it? I said, well, it has to do with railroads always had a lot of union activity. And in railroads, for this one, in order to actually accomplish the return of rail service, we had to get 24 unions to sign off on what we were trying to accomplish. And try doing that when you're the commissioner, small order. So George said, is that what it is? Is that? Oh, I said, yeah. So he said, I'll tell you what, I'll have my people get a hold of them. You bring down whoever you want to. I brought down one other person and we'll meet at a location here in DC. I'll see what I can do. Fast forward. We met at a hotel. The room was loaded, was at least 24, but I'm sure there are more than that. I know there was more than that. And then myself and one other person from the department that was in charge of rail. So Senator Mitchell comes into the room. He welcomes everybody and he said to the union, I want you to meet a friend of mine. I would love to have been George's friend, but that was an exaggeration beyond belief. And he said, I want you to meet a friend of mine who's in charge of a very special project to me that I want to see happen. And you guys, and it was all guys, have the responsibility of helping. So I'm asking you a favor. I'm going to come back at 3, this was like 9:30. I'm going to go back at 3 o'clock and I'm going to turn to Dana and say, Dana, did you get what you wanted out of this meeting? And I want him to be able to say yes. So I'm putting a favor in your hands to help me by agreeing to him. You get back at 3 o'clock and turn to me and say, Dana, did you get what you wanted? And I said, yes, I did. And I very much appreciate it, Senator. He said, thank you. And thank you guys. He left. That was more than statesmanship. That was leadership beyond description. And think about after he left. He was asked to go to Northern Ireland to sort out the religious problems. He was asked, that was Clinton. He was asked by Obama to go to the Mideast. He was asked to go into the baseball to straighten out a problem. It goes on and on. The guy was just simply amazing. There's one other thing that David asked that I jumped over because of my rambling that I'll bring to your attention. It was at DOT. And it's meaningful in this respect. And I'll try to reduce it to the simplest terms. But this particular, I've been there probably 3 years out of 11. And my assistant, Jane Lincoln, came into my office one day and said, hey, she closed the door. And I said, oh, this is going to be good. I don't like it when I close doors. And she said, our chief engineer just came in and was sharing with me something I need to tell you. I said, what is that? He said, his name was Dick Coleman, great guy. He said, we really like Dana. We like Dana a lot, but we don't understand him. We like Dana, but we don't understand him. My reaction was, what the? Do you not understand? I thought I was pretty clear. Obviously, I personally offended. Like I said, there's no place for ego. My ego was tarnished. So the next day, an HR gal came in that was very special and said, Dana, I know what the problem is. And if you have confidence in me, I can straighten it out. I said, yeah, have confidence. Just fix this. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. So we went off to Bethel Inn. There's a convention element up there. And we spent the day, and she had a teacher there that was learned in Myers-Briggs. Anybody here know what Myers-Briggs is?
Personality test.
It's a personality test. It's the way you approach problems to try to solve them. And there's various letters that indicate different things. Like one's an ENFP, which is really extroverted, intuitive, sensing. No, that's on the other side. Intuitive, feeling and perceiving. The I is introverted. It's thinking is the T. What the heck is the S? S is sensing, of course. Sensing, thinking, and the last one is judging, ISCJ. So when you do this test, you answer questions. There's no winners or losers, but you come out with a certain designation, and you can think of them multiple ways. It's not everybody's ENFP and ISCJs. It can be a multiplicity of options. Mine came out ENFP. They made me do the test over because the F was out of sight. That's the feeling one. That means when you make a decision, well, intuitive, you kind of know what that is. And F was feeling, how does this affect other people? And the perceiving was the flexibility, openness to ideas, more like transparency, communication, stuff like that. The IST was very structured, very planning was important, organization was important, facts were important, getting the job done right and doing it well was important. I come in ENFP, they come in ISTJ. In other words, I'm up in the freaking clouds thinking about vision and what comes next. They were on the ground getting the job done. Where, think about it, building roads and building bridges, you don't second guess that. You don't do it intuitively. You do it by the book. Believe it or not, that didn't, you know what changed by that? We understood each other. They knew how I thought, and I knew what made them work the way they did. It sounds overly simplified the way I say it, but I got to tell you, it's marvelous. It works miracles, and I'd recommend it. So there's a lot of things there. The last one I would say, and I'll do it so quickly, is that it's extremely, change as a parent. Don't fear it, embrace it, be smart about it, but accept it. If you always do what you always did and always get what you always got, it's probably not working anymore. Think about how our economy, our situation in the state have changed over the last 10 years. We're still now wrestling with artificial intelligence, and it's wonderful, but is it really all that wonderful? Why are there downsides? So it's, the point being, it's changing. And it can be good and it should be good, but we've got to stay with it. We've got to understand it. We need to have a plan. We need to have priorities. We, above all else, have to recognize that everything isn't negative in our state. There's tremendous positive, but we can't keep that to ourselves. We have to share that. We have to speak to it. It's uplifting. It's wonderful. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So
I gave you no time for questions.
got a lot of great things, stories to reflect on. That news is we don't have much time before our official stop.
Say,
Anybody here have a quick question? And if you have time to hang around and you want to come up, please do so. Obviously, you're never going to hear a talk like this again from someone who's spent more than half a century working with a lot of people, all of very different people, right? But all trying to get things done in a place I think we all care about. So thank you very much. So I don't think I'll try to squeeze in a question at all because we're at time. Sorry for folks.
appreciate it.